It is 9 a.m. in Tripoli, 2 p.m. in Hanoi, and 4 on a Friday afternoon here in Seoul. Welcome to the newscast. I'm Kim Hyun-ji. North Korea has sent an open letter to the South saying that it is determined to improve inter-Korean ties. South Korea has yet to respond, but Pyongyang's move is likely to be greeted with skepticism, given that it comes a matter of weeks before the start of joint military drills between Seoul and Washington. Our Hwang Sung-hee has the details.
North Korea says South Korea should not thoughtlessly doubt and rashly reject the sincere, important proposal it made last week to improve inter-Korean relations. Last week, Pyongyang offered to halt all cross-border slandering and asked Seoul to call off its annual joint military drills with Washington that take place between February and March. The offer was turned down flat by the South, which called it a disguised peace offensive. In an open letter addressed to South Korea on Friday, the North's powerful National Defense Commission said it had already halted all acts of slandering South Korea. North Korea has yet to react to comments made by President Park Geun-hye regarding the North during her trip to India and Switzerland, and the state-run Nodongshinmun newspaper has not published columns criticizing the South this week. It went on to say the North did not urge Seoul to stop ordinary military drills, but to halt drills for a war staged in collusion with outside forces. It said North Korea will first implement practical measures to end all hostile military acts that could aggravate the South. The letter claimed Pyongyang's nuclear program is purely defensive in nature and reiterated that its will for denuclearization should not be doubted. It stressed Pyongyang is determined to create an atmosphere of reconciliation, completely halt hostile military acts, realize the reunion of separated families, and to resume tours to Mount Kumgangsan in the north. Experts say this letter could be an attempt by the North to pressure the South Korean government into accepting its proposal by stressing its legitimacy. In an apparent extension of its attempt, Shin Sun-ho, the North Korean ambassador to the United Nations, is scheduled to hold a press conference in Geneva on Friday morning local time. Hwang Sung-hee, ARIRANG News.
In response to North Korea's open letter to the South, Seoul's defense ministry has said it is time for Pyongyang to show its sincerity through action, not words. Meanwhile, South Korea's unification ministry is expected to give its official response to the letter North Korea sent very shortly, and we will keep you updated on that in our later newscasts. Officials from the two Koreas are meeting on this Friday to discuss ways to ease restrictions on communications and transit at the inter-Korean Kaesong Industrial Complex. The talks are focused on improving an electronic identification system that would make it easier for South Korean businessmen going in and out of Kaesong. The officials are also in the early stages of discussing the adoption of internet connectivity at the complex. This meeting is the fourth round of talks between the two Koreas on communication systems at Kaesong. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe continues to rile his neighbors in Northeast Asia, defending once again his visit late last year to a controversial war shrine. He also compared Japan's current relationship with China to that of Britain and Germany before World War I. Both Beijing and Seoul were quick to respond, as our Yurian reports.
China has lashed back at Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe a day after he likened his nation's relationship with China to that of Germany and Britain before World War I.
The Japanese leader's memories of history cannot be misplaced. It would be better to face up to what Japan did to China before the war and in recent history than to say things about pre-World War I British-German relations.
Kang went on to say that Japan needs to come to terms with its militaristic history of invasions and colonizations. Only then, he said, would Tokyo improve its relations with neighboring Asian countries. Both Seoul and Beijing also had something to say about Abe once again, defending his visit to the controversial Yasukuni War Shrine, which honors several Class A war criminals. The Chinese spokesperson called those Class A war criminals the Nazis of Asia. Seoul's foreign ministry spokesperson Cho Tae-young took a somewhat softer stance. He said that paying respects at the Yasukuni Shrine is evidence that Japan has not repented for its imperialist past and that the continued visits to the shrine are simply incomprehensible. Cho added that his is the voice of not just Koreans, but the media, intellectuals, and sensible people in Northeast Asia and the world. Tensions have long been high between the three Asian countries due to territorial and historical disputes, but took a turn for the worse when Abe visited the war shrine in December. Yurian, ARIRANG News.
Meanwhile, China's foreign minister has also weighed in on the issue. On his ministry's website, Wang Yi said Prime Minister Abe's defense for visits to the Yasukuni Shrine merely serves to show that his understanding of history goes against the conscience of mankind and international duties. The head of the U.S. Pacific Command says tensions between China and Japan are likely to grow if they don't talk to each other. Speaking at a Pentagon news conference Thursday, Admiral Samuel Locklear said the risks can grow when two such large powers have a disagreement and are not talking to each other, and there is no clear resolution in sight. The admiral urged the two sides to seek a diplomatic solution to their dispute over an island chain in the East China Sea. Locklear also addressed the situation on the Korean peninsula, saying the U.S. military has refined its contingency plan for many possible scenarios in the north. Over in the U.S. state of Virginia, a state Senate bill to call the body of water between Korea and Japan both the East Sea and Sea of Japan in school textbooks has won overwhelming support to pass the legislature. 31 out of 38 lawmakers voted yes to the bill put forth by Democrat Senate member Dave Marsden, while only 4 voted no. The bill is the first state legislation that requires public schools in Virginia to teach students about both names. The Korean government argues the name Sea of Japan is a legacy of Japan's imperialistic past. In fact, the Japanese government has been lobbying Virginia lawmakers to block the bill. If the Virginia State House approves it, the bill would become effective as early as July 1st. Electronics giant Samsung Electronics has turned in a disappointing fourth quarter result. Overshadowed by the popularity of Apple's iPhone, the Korean company posted an 18% drop in operating profit. Our Shin Se-min has the details.
The world's biggest smartphone maker on Friday posted disappointing fourth quarter results, although its operating profit for all of 2013 reached an all-time high of 36 trillion won, or over $33 billion. Posting the first decline in its quarterly performance, Samsung said its profit for the October to December period fell 18% to $7.7 billion from the previous quarter. And this was also down 6% from a year earlier. The company said its profits were hit by the strength of the won. But the disappointing result was mainly due to its worse-than-expected earnings from its main smartphone business, which accounts for 2/3 of the company's entire operating profit. Yet the Korean brand maintained a market share of 30% in both developing and developed countries, reaffirming it as a top global brand. A Samsung Electronics official said the company is aiming to sell some 4 billion smartphones this year, an increase of 10% from last year, by expanding its smartphone line with new models and lower prices, and also by responding to growing LTE demands in Europe and China. The company's overall 2013 sales hit a record of $211 billion, up 14% from a year earlier. Its profits from its semiconductor and household appliance units both showed increases. Analysts say the coming year will depend largely on its performances in business for high-end smartphones and premium TVs, particularly in state-of-the-art ultra-high definition and curved panel televisions. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
In another news, Korea's largest automaker, Hyundai Motor, has reported a near 11% rise in last year's fourth quarter profit compared to the previous year. But its yearly operating profit for 2013 fell 1.5% to post $7.7 billion despite rising sales. Company officials say although Hyundai Motor saw good overseas sales figures, especially in China and the U.S., sluggish domestic demand, the strengthening Korean won, and the weakening Japanese yen put pressure on the yearly profit. Hyundai Motor has set its global sales target for this year at nearly 5 million cars, a near 4% jump from last year's performance. Hyundai's affiliate Kia Motors also saw its annual profit drop by nearly 10% last year. Let's now take a look at how the market closed here in Seoul. Shares traded lower this Friday, mainly due to lackluster earnings reports by major companies and fears that the Chinese economy may be slowing down. At the closing bell, the benchmark Kospi had dropped nearly 0.4% to finish at 1940, while the tech-heavy Kosdaq had dropped to 520. The Korean currency closed at 1,081 against the greenback. One of President Park Geun-hye's policy goals is to reform highly indebted public organizations, including public corporations, many of which have been criticized for their lax management and inefficiency. To delve into this issue, we are now joined by Dr. Kim Byung-ju, the head of KLMP Consulting and a regular commentator on this program. Hello, Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon.
So recent reports say public companies with huge debts have been paying their executives and directors more than 100 million won, which is about 93,000 US dollars, and that's very high. What is going on here?
Well, actually, interesting finding actually was released. I mean, we had a suspicion about what was going on here, but recently the lawmaker that belonged to the ruling party, Mr. Lee No-gun, actually released the interesting data that's based on the 2012 facts. And in Korea, as you mentioned, public organizations that includes highly controversial public corporations, the number is altogether about 300. And their average, when we look into this, about 300 organizations, overall what the lawmaker found was about 21,000 people are actually getting paid this hot button word 100 million won per year salary, and this is has become quite controversial. And looking into these public corporations that have become very controversial recently, some of these corporations where they have huge debts are showing even bigger numbers here. Some of the corporations, example includes KEPCO, for instance. KEPCO currently has about 3 trillion won debt as of 2012, and at that time they had people over 1,200 of them who are actually getting paid over this 100 million won per year salary. And in the case of KDIC, Korea Deposit Insurance Corporation, they had about, out of 600 employees, they had about 45 of them getting paid this much, about 7.5%. And actually, I missed this very important point. The lawmaker, Lee No-gun, one of his main point of revealing this data was as much as 8.4% of all the employees working in these public organizations actually were getting paid this amount of money, over 100 million won per salary. So 8.4% is a very high number. And going back to specific cases here, organizations like Korea Student Aid Foundation, which is supposed to be designed to give help to poor students, out of 216 employees in that foundation, as many as 30 of them, which is close to about 14% of the entire employees, were getting this 100 million won per year salary. So very, very controversial.
Wow. But don't private corporations pay more than that, 100 million won? So how do the salaries compare?
Private corporations, we would imagine that there will be a lot of people there, but we should think about the number here, relative size of it here. As I mentioned, the recent finding is very controversial because it shows 8.4% of the employees of these public organizations are getting paid more than 100 million won per year. Let's compare that with the private sector. In the private sector in Korea, we have about the 15 million people who are wage earners here in Korea. So out of 15 million, how many people actually get paid that much? The number is 2.6% as opposed to 8.4%. So like what? About 4 times? So that is why it's very, very controversial, and that's why probably there's a great momentum behind this government drive to reform these public organizations and public corporations.
Wow, 2.6 versus 8.4%. Wow.
Big time gap.
Yeah, big contrast there.
Right.
So is it true that many public corporation directors are getting paid way more than anyone in the government?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, of course, you may say, if you compare with the government officials, that's not exactly a great reference point. But let's consider how much the president of this nation is making every year. She is making about 186 million won per year. Okay, that's a lot of money. But the thing is, if we consider those 12 public corporations that became very controversial because of their humongous debt, how much are they getting paid, those 12 corporations? The top executives, the heads and the chairmen, and they make, on average, 219 million won, as opposed to 186 million won that President of Korea makes. So, okay, of course, people don't become the president of the nation to make money here, but still they're saying, consider another fact. Prime Minister of this country is making 144 million per year, as opposed to, once again, 219 million that heads of these 12 public corporations are making. So, once again, there is a considerable gap in the minds of the public.
Yeah, that is very huge. It seems that news of corruption and unethical management at public corporations is always followed by calls for privatization.
Right.
What is your take on it? Is privatization really the answer to these issues with public corporations?
Well, depending on whom you're asking, but the thing is, in reality, in Korea these days, we have to admit the fact that privatization, the word has become a dirty word. The railroad workers and the medical doctors, they staged strikes, and they are talking about staging a strike based on their cause of going against the privatization drive that government is thinking about. That just tells us that they believe if they use the privatization, they can justify their causes of creating this kind of interesting scenes where they can promote their interest here. So, in this anti-privatization mood that we see in Korea, which some of these groups rely upon, what we notice is this understanding of the people, where in these private corporations, private-owned corporations, these are the people who are kind of like a dirty-minded and greedy people who only seek their own private gains. And while in public entities, when we do not seek privatization, the same kind of people will work hard with strong commitment for public goods. I think there's a great discrepancy in terms of understanding human nature here. So when we see this kind of evidence of public corporations, public organizations, people getting a lot of money while there is a weak monitoring here, I think we confirm once again it's all same human being we're talking about, and assuming that by avoiding privatization we can promote public goods has its own flaw in terms of its own logic.
So they definitely need to reform itself, but we don't know exactly how they should go about doing it.
Right, I suppose, recently what we saw in financial sector was like the heads of the 4 largest financial holding groups, right? The chairmen, they had their salary cut about 30–40%. And some of the biggest banks, heads, presidents, they saw their salaries being cut. Are we expecting the same thing for this public corporation, the heads? Well, I'm not sure whether that will be the case or not. It's not going to be very easy. Maybe we will get to see some pay cuts for these heads of the corporations here, but down the ladder, underneath their ranks, the other executives and their workers, well, they have their own labor organizations and so on. So it will be a long way to go to see that kind of adjustment in the lower level. So I don't think we'll get to see the repetition of what we saw in Korea's banks and Korea's financial holding companies in this reform drive effort.
But wouldn't the government force that they cut the salaries of their
They were
executives?
successful in financial sector, but I don't think it will be easy with these public corporations because they have strong labor unions.
Okay. Well, Dr. Kim, thank you as always for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you.
We will see you next week.
Okay.
President Park Geun-hye is expected to issue thousands of special pardons ahead of the Lunar New Year holiday next week. The Justice Ministry says the pardons will be issued to roughly 6,000 people whose livelihoods have been affected by their convictions. The list of beneficiaries is expected to include first-time offenders and small business owners charged with minor crimes, as well as people who have had driver's licenses suspended or revoked. The pardons will be discussed during a cabinet meeting next Tuesday and are expected to be issued right before Lunar New Year holiday, which begins on Thursday. Democratic Party leader Kim Han-gil and independent lawmaker An Chol-soo have found common ground on two main issues related to elections. At a luncheon meeting in Seoul earlier this Friday, the two leaders agreed that the system in which political parties nominate their own candidates for elections needs to be abolished, as it acts as a breeding ground for money for nomination scandals. They also called for a separate prosecutorial investigation into allegations that the nation's spy agency and the military interfered in the 2012 presidential election. The two opposition leaders did not, however, talk about whether they would join forces to run in local elections slated for June 4th. Switching gears now, Korea's financial authorities have pledged to step up their crackdown on credit card verification companies and brokers to prevent further distribution of personal information stolen from banks following the worst data leak in Korea's history. They also said they would issue harsh punishments to credit card companies that take advantage of the recent breach to attract new customers. The regulators say anyone found to have leaked personal data in the future could be sentenced to up to 5 years in prison and fined 50 million won or $46,000. The authorities also plan to launch a center with the help of related government offices, whose mission will be to prevent the stolen data from falling into the wrong hands. The latest bird flu outbreak seems to be following the routes of migratory birds wintering in Korea. Another flock of ducks was found dead in central Korea, north of the original infection site, confirming that the bird flu virus is spreading. So far, up to 400,000 ducks and chickens have been killed, and it looks like more will have to be slaughtered in the future. Our Connie Lee has more.
As flocks of migratory birds made their way around Korea this winter, it seems they were both the carriers and the victims of the latest bird flu outbreak. On Friday, local officials announced that more ducks have been found dead in a city closer to Seoul in the central province of Chungcheongnam-do. And further south, in the nation's port city of Busan, officials are testing to see if a group of dead birds found there also tests positive for the latest H5N8 strain of bird flu. As their exact cause of death is being determined, officials have confirmed that another group of ducks found dead in a river in Chungcheongnam-do province was infected with the H5N8 strain of avian influenza. This is the first confirmation that AI has spread to other regions in the country. The ducks found in the Kumgang River in Seocheon-gun County were found about 50 kilometers north of Gocheon-gun County in Jeollabuk-do province, or the area where the bird flu outbreak started. To prevent the virus from spreading any further, local officials in Chungcheongnam-do have expanded the quarantine, banning the movement of farm workers and equipment within a 10-kilometer radius of the infected area. But these efforts may not be enough. Korea's Ministry of Environment says there are currently about 360,000 migratory birds in the southern and central parts of Korea, which is likely to make containment more difficult than anticipated. So far, a total of 9 farms have now been confirmed to be infected with the H5N8 strain of bird flu. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
An uneasy truce is holding between the government and the opposition in Ukraine after the two sides held talks Thursday to try and end the violent protests that have started to spread across the country. Speaking to protesters, opposition leaders gave assessments of their talks with President Viktor Yanukovych. Kim Min-ji reports.
Ukraine's opposition leaders appeared before protesters early Friday after talks with President Viktor Yanukovych that went late into the night. Addressing thousands of people in central Kiev, boxer-turned-politician Vitaly Klitschko gave an account of the talks, saying that hours of conversation were spent about nothing.
Long hours of conversations about nothing. Now I understand. To sit down at the same table with a man who has already decided to lie to you is pointless.
Another opposition leader present at the talks, Ole Tianibok, said that the president has agreed to release all protesters that have been detained during the unrest. The third participant, Arseny Yasunuk, said after the talks finished late Thursday, there was a high chance the violence could be stopped.
We had a mission to stop the bloodshed, and there is a pretty good chance to stop the bloodshed.
In a sign that he could be right, Yanukovych has called for an emergency parliamentary session next week. Amid the talks, rallies took place in several cities across the nation, and protesters built more barricades in Kiev early Friday after opposition leaders emerged empty-handed from the talks. Violent protests have been raging in the capital since last weekend. At least 3 protesters were killed Wednesday in clashes in Kiev, the first deaths in 2 months of protests. The anti-government protests flared in late November after Yanukovych decided to walk away from an integration deal with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
That's all from us for this hour. Stay tuned to ARIRANG for stories making headlines in Korea and around the world. More news updates coming your way on Early Edition at 6.